Thank you. Good morning. This is the hardcore crew, right? This is, oh my God. Is that a little too voice of God for you? So you've had a good time, you've come, you've learned a lot of stuff, you've heard sessions, you've written lots of notes, you've gotten inspired, you have great ideas, and now it's time to get on the planes, trains, automobiles, and go back to your settings, go back to your libraries, go back to the real world, and it's time to figure out what to do with all this. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk a little bit about leadership. Because I think oftentimes I'll blame library schools for a moment, we do when we talk about leadership is a lot of giving this grand utopian vision and giving some technology skills and throwing people into the world and say, change, go make it happen. And we all know that it's a little bit harder than that. And so I thought it would be useful to spend some time, particularly because if you know me, technology to me is a crucial lever for change in a larger mission. So I want to talk about that, and to do that, I want to start by talking about what I mean by leadership. So I learned a really interesting lesson when I was the place where I took this picture, which was in Florence. And when you go to Florence, there are certain things that you've got to do. And one of them is go see the David, which is at the Académie Française, Firenze. And I went into this museum and I saw the David and I snuck my picture that I wasn't supposed to, but it was with a cell phone camera, so it's crap. But I'm wandering around and I see this group gathered by a locked gate. And there are a couple of languages spoken, but then I see someone who comes up and sort of introduces themselves as the tour guide in English, and so I quickly run into the group. And they unlock the door and you walk in, and inside, what it is, it's about a room not quite this long, but about 20 feet high, rather narrow, and it's full of plaster sculptures. Because what I did not realize is when you go and do artwork, when you go and do marble sculptures, you start in plaster and you embed all these little pins into it so you can find the right proportions when you do the final work on marble. And along the walls are shelves, and on the shelves are these head and shoulder busts, top to bottom of the floor. And as I'm sort of marveling at the room, I catch what the tour guide is saying. And she's pointing to his wonderful painting. She goes, and this is the problem. This is the problem. And she looks at it and she goes, the problem, and this was the problem. And she keeps mentioning problems as she's walking around to this wonderful Renaissance art, which, being an art major, this is like Mecca. And she says, the problem is that when she's pointing to the painting, is that it's very photographic. And I thought, well, I would think that's a success for these folks. And they said, no, the problem was that they really could only represent things in a photographic-like style. And so it really limited them. They could add a wing here or there for an angel and a halo here and there, but they were really stuck with trying to represent reality. And it stifled painting for hundreds of years. And then she points to the busts along the wall and she says, you can see that all of these look very similar, and that's the problem. I mean, here we are back with the problem as I'm marveling at this stuff. And she goes, the ones along the bottom row, those are the sculptures of the masters. And every row above it are classes, and it's their final project. And so what happens is, in order to sort of get out and get your stamp of approval in Renaissance art, your sculpture has to be as good as the masters along the bottom. And the problem that she was pointing out, and it became very clear to me, was not only do you have to be so good that you can't tell the difference between the student and the master, you have to be exactly like the master in order to get out. That really this training was about conforming. That the folks in Florence had thought they had achieved the style of art. They had gotten to the highest possible ground. It started like with cavemen with charcoal, and then it turned into brushes, and then Florence happened and we were done. Right? And in fact, the entire education system, the entire method was to bring people to that point. And it ultimately killed art in Italy. Because innovation couldn't happen in a place where they were conforming to one standard aesthetic. And so interesting art started happening in France and in Germany and the United States and all these things, and because the Italians were stuck. And it was at that point that I realized that leadership and innovation are deeply intertwined. So when I talk about leadership, I don't really mean titles. This doesn't mean you have a leadership title. And it doesn't mean sort of anointed status. What it really means is the ability to lead and push forward and innovate. Because simply achieving some level of administration does not mean that you're a good leader. What I not want to talk about is the ability to execute. You know, the idea we have a policy and we can perform it. We have a strategic plan and we can follow it. That's not the kind of leadership I'm talking about. It really is the leadership to invent, to create, to innovate, and to drive the field forward. So let's talk about how we're going to talk about that today. So here's my outline, hopefully. There we go. I want to start by talking. I grew up in Cincinnati, by the way, so this is like hometown. I went to my high school reunion on Friday. So I'm a little nostalgic here. So, you guys who went to Graders? Anyone get some chili? Yeah, wimps. Yeah. It's good. So I think about, when I look at leadership, one of the most crucial parts of leadership in pushing any organization forward are mentors. And I want to talk about some of the lessons I've learned from my mentors. And I want to talk about the legacies that these mentors create. And I want to talk about the fact that the fields have mentors. We in the library profession have mentors that we've looked throughout history. And what is their legacy and what is their role? Talking about creating a new legacy, and finally coming back to the idea of accepting the obligation of leadership. So that's our morning. All right, and I'll try to make it brief so that you can get to the planes on time. I want to talk about 3 of my mentors and what they taught me. The first mentor is my father. That's the Marlboro Man up there. And that's me with the really styling red plaid pants. I want to talk about a colleague of mine named Jeffrey Katzer. And I want to talk about my first dean, Ray Von Drain. So I want to go through briefly talking about the shapes that these men have had on my life. And before you start whacking on me for gender issues, I should point out that my mother is in the audience. And we know that any credit for success I have belongs to her. So, these people I can... What I learned from these guys I put on a slide. From what I learned from her takes me a lifetime. Okay, so let's talk about Richard Lankus here. If you ever wondered why it's R. David Lankus, it's because he got to the name first and didn't want to share it. And so I had to use the middle name. And he was an interesting man. He had a sense of humor where he could memorize 3,000 bad jokes and produce them at any one time. He also had this really horrible, I call it like the anti-Jeopardy syndrome, where he had an answer for everything regardless of whether he knew it or not. So it became very clear to me when I was watching Jeopardy I was watching a documentary one day, and it's talking about the circulation of the heart, and he's sitting watching this, and it's like, and then the blood goes into the ventricles, atrium, and then it goes over to the kidney, lungs, and then, it's like, Dad, really? But one of his favorite jokes that I still use to this day in terms of leadership was this one. How can you tell a pioneer in the crowd? He's the one with all the arrows in his backside. Now, he did not use the word backside, but my mother's in the audience, so we're going to go with that. And now, and I'm sorry, this is terribly personal, but as a parent now with 2 boys, I've realized that some of the greatest lessons we get from our mentors and those we look up to are ones never deliberately presented to us as lessons. That oftentimes it's the actions and how they work that teach us these things. And so I was with him on a sales call. The man was a serial entrepreneur. He started, he went to Rutgers, didn't quite work out, went out and sold tombstones in Oklahoma, had his father buy him a bus ticket to go back to Buffalo, and that must have been a fun drive home, where he started cleaning ink out of ink mixing tanks and turned into the head of sales for Borden Chemicals, got to the top of that, quit it, started his own business, sold it off, quit it, started his own business, sold it off. Right? So this is a guy who really worries about, he gets bored easily. And he brought me on one of these sales calls into Los Angeles, and I was 13, and we went and did what people at that time did in Los Angeles, is we went on the Universal Studio tours, right? This is back before they had roller coasters and we had carts and mechanical jaws popping out at us. And we were going through on these carts, and we pull up to this sort of empty room surrounded by big buildings, empty spot surrounded by big buildings. And the tour guide says, well, I'm a little early, but I've got to go. Your next person will come soon. Get off the bus. So like 20, 30 of us file off the bus. Off goes the bus. And we're sitting there. And we're sitting there. And we're sitting there. And finally, my father turns to me and he said, son, you can't always wait for a leader. Let's go. And he sort of stood up proudly and headed for the nearest building, and everyone sort of looked around and started following right along. And I would love to say that it ended up by us walking into a soundstage, and if you go see, James Bond, we're in it. But it turns out he was right, which he always, sorry, other issues with my father. But this lesson sticks into my head, which is you can't wait for a leader. You're mulling around in sort of, well, what do we do? Where do we go? Well, let's wait for the next person, when sometimes that person may not come. So that's that's some of the leadership lessons I learned from my father. I want to talk now about another man, Jeffrey Katzer. Jeffrey Katzer was a colleague of mine at Syracuse University, and he was frighteningly brilliant. He was the terror of the PhD program. And I mean, nicest guy you'd ever want to meet, funny, hilarious, but if you ever got him on a dissertation committee, you knew you were dead. Because he was the quant guy, he was the stats guy, right? So he understood what a harmonic mean and a Pearson R was, and you're like, ah! Right? But he was an interesting fellow. In fact, he was interim dean at the School of Information Studies twice. And what he mentioned once was, I said, well, it's cool, you're interim dean. Congratulations, Jeff. He goes, yeah, what that means is you get to put your career on hold for 3 years while you do 1 year of work. Right? But he still did it. And he was also a funny guy, and this is one of my favorite sayings I use of his all the time, which is that change is like heaven. Everyone thinks it's a good idea, but nobody wants to go first. In fact, this was the guy who his major contribution in statistics was the quantification of error, right? And so he would write, you have your dependent variables plus your independent variables plus error equals your sample. And then he would partially erase it, and he'd always leave the plus error part up, which read terror. And, there was that nervous kind of laughter, like, But this was an interesting point, which was that leadership is scary. I think a lot of times we come to conferences like this and we hear inspirational speakers, and it's kind of like, go change the world. See you next Thursday, right? And it takes guts. It takes guts to stand up and be that leader. It takes guts. I mean, sometimes you're going to end up with arrows in your backside, right? But at the same time, isn't sometimes feeling pain better than feeling nothing? I mean, have you ever, wouldn't you rather risk something and try something than sort of drown in a sea of mediocrity, of waiting for that next step? And I know a lot of you are innovators and change agents where you've tried it and you've gotten beaten down. And I've run too many librarians who've had, as the Urban Libraries Council put it, the testosterone beaten out of them. That we go and we try and it doesn't work, and we try and it doesn't work, and eventually it wears us down. And I think that we often need to think about, what? We still have to try. And that's a hard thing. And what's even harder is sometimes the difference we're going to make isn't even at the organization we're at now. And that's the hardest thing. The hardest decision of, do I go and risk being a leader, changing my environment, living up to what I think we can be, or do I sit and do I wait? The third person I want to talk briefly about is a fellow by the name of Ray Von Dran, or as we kindly knew him, Bubba. And Bubba came to the School of Information Studies. He was my first dean. And I said, and he really was like a second father to me. And he took me under his wing, and he really showed me how to lead. And he showed me that sometimes leading isn't standing up here giving these great speeches. It's oftentimes going from office to office and talking and chatting. But I think the biggest lesson that Ray taught me, he taught me two. One was that leadership is not about careerism. I think sometimes we look at those people who go and become directors, associate directors, whatever, and we assume that they're doing it so they can get bigger paychecks and bigger ego. And he said, that's true, but that's not true leadership. Leadership is service. Leadership is the idea that if we don't step up and take the bat, the person who does is not necessarily the person most qualified to. That if we don't take this, I've run into too many librarians that like, oh, are you going to take that management position? No, because then I'll be in administration and I won't be able to do X, Y, or Z. I'm really good at the reference desk and I'm making a lot of difference. And if I become supervisor, then I won't be able to do that anymore. But that's exactly the person that we need to take that ownership position. The other thing he taught me, and it's a lesson that still rings true to me, that true mentorship is wanting those you mentor to do better than you. And that's a very interesting lesson. If you're a mentor, the ultimate sign of success is that that person eventually becomes your boss, that that person eventually outshines you. And that takes a lot of strong self-confidence that Ray had. The ability to say, you know, someday you're going to be better than me, and you're going to outgrow the advice I give. And that's a scary thing for us to do. And someday, it's going to be your turn to step up. I worry sometimes about library science education that some of our greatest thought leaders look at administration as a toil that they don't want to step up to. Oh, I'm too busy doing research, and that's my impact. But if we don't have people who become library directors, branch managers, head of services, deans and directors, whatever it is, then what we're saying is we're abdicating all the good people to busy doing the work, and those that interface with the rest of the world and get us the resources, those are the people who have the ego and want the money. And that's problematic. Now, these three men have something else in common, which is they were all called off this earth way too early. This is actually the 10th anniversary year of my father's death. Ray died last year. Jeff died a few years ago. And it hurts when these leaders move on, when these mentors move on. There's not a day goes by that I don't want to pick up the phone and call them and ask them about what I should do now. There's not a day that goes by I don't want to stop into an office and say, God, I'd have to deal with this. Help me. Lead me. Guide me. Show me where we're going. And yet, there's silence. And after each person passed away, it took me months to figure out how can I, their mentor, move forward, or their mentee, move forward without their advice and without their counsel. How can I continue when I don't have these voices pushing me along? And I want to give you some of the conclusions I came up with. The first is that they did teach you principles. They taught you basics. I mean, my father would have loved living in the days of Twitter and social networks and webs because he was even more of a geek than I was. And yet he taught me principles in how I approach leadership and technology that span what is the current trend. And what's very interesting is the last thing that any of these men wanted for me was the status quo. Remember, what Ray taught me was to be better than him. And that means to improve and to think newly. Right? Unlike the Florentine model, the Florentine dilemma, where they were trying to create clones, when they were trying to say, you're done. And in fact, in many ways, the academy was set up to prevent innovation, to stop evolution, because they'd done it. But all of these people, last thing they wanted was the status quo. In fact, they pushed to break it. And I would tell you that the library field, that we all have mentors that we read about and that we hear about. I mean, you know, the obvious ones like Dewey and Raghunathan, Lancaster, Bob Taylor, Ann Lippo, who told us to think differently, look at this stuff. And what I learn when I look at those field-wide mentors is that leaders throughout our history have fought for radical change. It's really interesting. When we talk about Melville Dewey in this sort of either dismissive way or this sort of awe-inspiring way, think about what Melville Dewey wanted. Melville Dewey was even more of a geek than I am. He wanted the metric system. Not only did he want the metric system and wanted us to change how we spell, he sold gadgets. I mean, if you ever read the book, this was how he's going to make his money. He was going to sell all these metric measuring devices and such to schools. He always wanted to change the world. Raghunathan looked at Indian libraries and libraries in general and said, we're not doing well enough. I want to change the world. Ann Lippo, when she said, the user is not remote from us, we are remote from them, wanted to change our attitudes. All these people that we look to as a field and talk about foundational thinking were radicals. All of these people were innovators. All of these people had arrows in their backsides at one point or another. All of them had to stand up and challenge the status quo. So when I look at mentors and when I talk about mentors at a field-wide, the mentors and people that I respect and that have made the field the way they are people who stood up, who took leadership positions, and fought for change. Not those who were necessarily the most brilliant in their initial impacts. And so what I want to talk about now is what are some of those core principles that these people have laid down that as we look at librarianship and say, you know what, we can do better. What are those core principles? I'm going to give you my list. There are plenty of lists out there. Service. That librarians are about service. That ultimately our job is to improve the communities that we are a part of. But I want to be really clear that that word is not servant. It is service. To be of service is to have a voice and a presence. I think too often as librarians we disappear. We believe that our job is to be invisible in the process, and yet we are the ones who should be seen and be known for doing it. We should be pushing and prodding our community and not simply waiting for them to ask. To be of service means to look for what is right and push for it. So a whistleblower in a government agency is doing a service when he talks out. It is not going with the flow. It is not being the good soldier who simply obeys the existing structure. It is one who looks at the structure and says, we can do better, and the service is to improve. Knowledge. We're not in the thing business. We're not in the information business. We're in the job of what's in people's heads. Knowledge does not reside in things. This is not knowledge. This is knowledge. Everything that we do is about knowledge and learning. That we are about learning. Melville Dewey, going back to one of those mentors, saw the public library as a co-equal educational institution to the public schools. Now, when you're an academic library, you're in a special library, you're in a school library, you're in a public library, your job is learning. One, us learning to be better librarians, but to teach and to bring people in. Oftentimes, we need to start talking about in our libraries, what is the curriculum that we offer to our patrons? And that's something we don't normally ask. Well, we provide services to them. Having conversation, now I'm going to pick on you the whole time. My mother, who was a third grade teacher, and her with friends have sort of opened a community library. And she was talking about this fourth grader who walked up with a series of books, and they were sort of picture books. And my mother looked at them, and I love her dearly, and said, oh, we can do better. Those books aren't really very challenging to you, and in a third grade way sort of took her and talked about what chapter books were and what she could do better and how that might help her reading. In essence, she brought a curriculum to a reference transaction. It wasn't simply fulfilling a need, it was seeing the larger need. We talked about the idea that a library, the best way to teach someone to read is not to take a 5-year-old, throw them into a room full of books and say, good luck. Doesn't work. That's access. You have access to the knowledge, but you have no skill in utilizing it. All too often, we get people to that world of books, that world of materials, that world of resources, when they have no skill to deal with it. That's what learning means. Intellectual freedom, access. Now, some of you may look at this and see a few things missing. Here's one that often is pointed out. Where's unbiased in this? I don't like the word unbiased because, one, I don't believe it's possible. I believe that when you ask a question and someone reaches for a book or reaches for the keyboard, they've shown a bias. When you look at the collection, it shows a bias. When you look at the classification, it shows a bias. This is how we exist in our life, is that we have predetermined ideas. They're called heuristics about how that works. I think a much better phrase for unbiased is intellectually honest. If someone comes in and asks for evolution books because they're doing a biology exam, do we have to not just show them creationism at the same time because we're being unbiased? Well, what about all the, do we also bring the Bible that has Genesis in it? And do we bring the Quran in that has a creation story? And do we bring in the Zoroastrians that have a creation? We don't do that. We show a bias in how we do it. But we're intellectually honest in that we can state what that bias is, what our perspective is, and in service, we are willing to put that aside for the need of that user. If that user asks for something specifically, that's our main goal. The other thing that may be missing is that the notion of what we do, what is at the core of our activities. And you'll notice that on almost every mission statement, there's this discussion of recorded knowledge. That ultimately our job is the recorded knowledge. Books, videos, web pages, they're all recorded knowledge. This is our job. We organize and disseminate this. But I ask the question, is the focus there on recorded or is the focus there on knowledge? So take a look at this book. Is this really our focus? It's got no words, no content, no text. Is that really the job we're in? Right? I don't think that we're in the thing business. What's very interesting is I believe we are in the last days of the document. The concept of document is dying. What is Facebook? Is it a document? How do you do a MARC record for Google? How do you talk about what's a book when every page and every character on that is accessible through a search engine? We've seen the book break down into the chapter, break down into the passage. In the interlibrary alone, we've looked at requests for journals go right to the ground, while requests for articles go up. The journal in most academic libraries is no longer a very meaningful concept. Are we going to move to the point of I need this section, this passage, this quotation? Right? I think that we really have moved away from the core of librarianship being recorded knowledge, and we're getting back to more that we are in the knowledge business. And that knowledge, once again, resides with people. So when I ask the question about what is the true mission of the library, I have to come down and say, well, let's see, service, knowledge. If we're in the knowledge business, what does that mean? And I go back to a fellow by the name of Gordon Pask, who was a cybernetician, and he really looked at the question of knowledge and learning. And at the time, he wanted to teach machines to think. And he said, well, until artificial intelligence catches up, we're going to use natural intelligence to model. And so what he started looking at is how people learn. And he came up with something called conversation theory that states that knowledge is created through conversation. Now, this conversation could be like this, one to many. It could be one-to-one, talking to your mentors. It can be group to group. When you sit down and you negotiate something with a vendor, you're having a conversation. And you're generating artifacts out of that, which are agreements. But you can also have a conversation with yourself. Now, a lot of people on the reference desk are scared of people having conversations with themselves. Rightly so. But think about it. If you're sitting there right now going, when is this guy going to be done? Who are you talking to? Right? And this morning when you asked, does this make me look fat? Who am I talking to? Right? You talk to yourself all the time. You're having a conversation with yourself, and that's okay. Let's all just agree that it's okay to talk to yourself, preferably quietly, in a corner, alone. Right? It's called metacognition or critical thinking for the instruction folks, but they're conversations. And if libraries are in the knowledge business and not the thing business, we're in the conversation business. So what is that core? Is it document or is it knowledge? And if it's knowledge, it's conversation. Now this has some really, we call this participatory librarianship, and it has some pretty major impacts. People need to be active constructors of their knowledge. You can't sit back and passively be part of a conversation, because then you're not having a conversation. If people learn, they engage. And they need to be active in that engagement process. If you have two people sitting up and talking at each other at the same time, that's not a conversation. If you're sitting right now working on your blog entry or your expense report and not listening to me, which is fine, we're not having a conversation. But we have to be active. There has to be waiting, there has to be thinking, there has to be analyzing, there has to be back and forth. And they want tools that allow and facilitate that conversation and participation. They want to be part of it. And so what happens is, when you look, they go to Encarta and they go to Britannica and they go to Learn, and the tools say, here is the right answer. No discussion, please. What do? They go to Wikipedia. They don't go to Wikipedia because it's good and it's easy and it's free and whatever. They go because they can be part of that community. They can make discussion. They can see what the conversation is. They can see the tumult. A lot of what we talk about, for example, in higher education is, oh, it's crap unless it's peer-reviewed. oh, it doesn't matter unless it's peer-reviewed. And yet the interesting part of scholarship and action and academia is the ferment of discussion that says, is this even important to ask? The battles that we have on what is the paradigm today and what's the methodology. It's the fight and the conversation that makes things interesting. And so what happens when they go to your tools? What happens when they go to the library catalog? What happens when they go to the library website and they want to learn and they want to participate? If they go to the physical library, increasingly we say, here's a room that you can work with. Here's a whiteboard that you can talk to. Here's a comfy space. And then they come to our websites and it says, here's stuff. Now I look at social bookmarking and I look at lots of really cool stuff that we're adding, and I think we're starting to head in the right direction. There's a pressure on every organization to participate, and it should be. Because think about the conversations that are going on in our communities, and I don't care if our communities are lawyers or business people, teachers, faculty, students, Joe the plumber, you betcha. I'll be doing the rest of the meeting with my Sarah Palin impersonation. Don't you know? Okay. What's going on in our communities? I mean, this is what's really interesting. If you think about it, there's discussions, for example, about what do we do with senior populations, and it's happening across all that demographic. That's an amazing conversation to be part of, and the library needs to be there. Not only to talk about what the impact on the library is, but to talk about what does it mean to age well, and how do we age well, and what's going on. That's a conversation that we can be a part of. And that's much more interesting than what do we mark record. Right? The idea of politics. Right now, if we don't have a conversation going on about race in America, about politics, what's happening? Are we ignoring that? Do we simply say, oh, we can't talk about politics. That's unbiased and we can't. Why not? Why can't we have a conversation, not say who to vote for and what to vote for, but certainly there's some interesting discussions about the idea of what are the issues, where are the issues, how do we handle it. We have people walking around talking about one of the presidential candidates as a terrorist. What are you doing to support or to break that notion? And if that's going on, that's a failure on our part because we're the conscience in the conversation of the community. That's an important conversation. And if we back away and say, oh no, spotlight's too hot, we have failed the community. What's going on with conversations about business and entrepreneurship and getting ahead and how to start a business? And not simply saying, how to start a business. Here's a book called How to Start a Business. By the way, you're going to need a business plan. You have no idea what that is. By the way, you're going to need to talk to a lawyer. You have no idea who they are. By the way, you're going to need an accountant. We don't do that. By the way, there are regulatory requirements. Why don't we set up that curriculum? Why don't we teach them what a business plan is? Why don't we do field trips out to successful entrepreneurs in local communities? Why don't we arrange meeting spaces with vendors and entrepreneurs in our spaces? Discussions such as terrorism, such as what's going on. There's a huge amount in all of our communities, a huge amount of concern, of fear, What are we doing to contribute to that conversation? What do we do with taking real-world concerns over the world and the economy and saying, you know what, I know you just heard that the stock market plummeted. Do you want to know what that means? Not waiting for them to come in and hope they can ask the right question so we can go find them the book. But to proactively go out and say, this is what the community needs to know. Let's work on that. Let's pull that together. Because ultimately, this is the power of libraries, not what we can collect and how much we can count. The power of libraries has nothing to do with the number of volumes we have on our shelf. The power of libraries is the impact we have on the communities and societies that we serve. I don't care if you want to call it Web 2.0 or Library 2.0, because it's going to be the same in Library 3.0, 4.0, 12.0, and 1000.0. It's about conversations and knowledge. This is the noble mission that libraries have. I think often we are afraid to have conversations of nobility. I think oftentimes as libraries we shy away from the concept that we are fundamental to a democracy. In the humanities, they talk about the great conversation. They talk about how artists and analysts and writers and philosophers for centuries have been talking about what it means to live a good life, what it means to live in a democracy, what it means to take hold of your life and make it better. This is our tradition. The tradition of libraries is not forged out of catalogers. We need them. They're tools that provide. The mission of the library did not get invented when people needed to get cheap Danielle Steele novels. We use those to teach people and prepare them for literacy. The mission of the library did not grow out of saving on book costs. That shaped some of our service. The mission of the library is to make the world a better place. Everyone here is in a noble profession. Our tradition comes from people like James Madison, who talked about popular governments without popular information is a prologue to a farce or a tragedy. That's our mission. Our mission is rooted in the great conversation of people like Thomas Jefferson, who said that the people are the only censor to their governors. That the way to prevent errors is to give full information in affairs. That doesn't mean giving stuff. That means building knowledge. This is the conversation that we are a part of. These are Shakespearean times we live in. I think oftentimes, I was talking to a doctoral student, and I said, what research do you want to do? She's like, something like information organization. I said, why? I find it interesting. I said, how are you going to change the world with it? And she looked at me like I had 12 eyes and, thing. The question you need to ask every morning is, how are you going to change the world? Another mentor of mine, former advisor, still alive, Mike Eisenberg, talked to me at one point. We were talking about the meaning of success. And he posited the St. Peter test. He says, all right, someday you die, you go up to heaven, and St. Peter's waiting by the pearly gates. By the way, he fully realized the irony of this test coming from a Jewish man. And he said, St. Peter's going to look at you and said, well, did you make it better? This is the difference between a job and a vocation. This is the difference between being impassioned and being efficient. Did you make it better? Did you change the world? Maybe you changed that world in one person. Everyone has the story. Every librarian has the story. It's a story that we keep locked away somewhere so that in the hard days of 12 questions about bad toner and where's the bathroom, in the hard days of this PHP module is not working and I don't understand this licensing agreement, and I'm frustrated and the committee I have to go to again is driving me nuts, we pull out this story. Maybe that story is as simple as I had someone come in, I showed them the book that turned out to be their favorite book in the world. Maybe that story is I had a woman come in and ask questions about domestic abuse and I helped her get out of a bad relationship. Maybe that story are kids that I turned on to their lifelong ambition. Maybe that story is that contribution I made to the physics paper. But there's a story that says, this is why I was here. That story, that conversation is what makes us a noble profession. So I have to ask you a question. Are we ready? Are we ready in these great times of great opportunities, this historic world we're living in? Are we ready to embrace and be part of that conversation? When we look at things like catalogs and we look at the interfaces that we provide to our materials and we look at our websites, I ask you, are we ready? And the answer is, we can do better. I don't say this because you've done horrible in the past and in remediation. I know it because as I go from library to library and talk from person to person, I hear the passion. I hear the inventiveness. I hear the challenge that's there that constantly every day says, we can do better. How can we do better? Well, we need to start putting out tools that are about discovery and not about inventory. Our catalogs are about inventory. They're about where something is if you know where you want it. We need to talk about discovery, of mapping knowledge, about capturing understanding. Let's face it, we need to stop adding lipstick to pig. If you have a system that is about inventory, if you have a system that is about stuff, have a system that doesn't reflect the conversations of your community, no matter how many lists, no matter how many tags, no matter how many cloud views you add to them, they will still be about stuff and inventory. I like things like pen tags that they said, we're going to build a communal tagging service and we can tag stuff if it's in a catalog, if it's on our proprietary databases, if it's on the web, because frankly, it's just another database. It's just another database. We need to stop having conversations about the next generation of catalogs and commit to this being the last generation of catalogs. We're done. I don't want to ever say, boy, when Melville Dewey did something in 1890, he figured out 2008 pretty well. We need to be done. We need to take all that effort, that great, brilliant ideas, and instead of trying to evolve the dinosaur slightly forward out of the tar pit, think about what's brand new. Now, I want to be really clear here. This is not the library vendors have really screwed us over conversation. I want library vendors to do this. I want us to do it in every place. I think that if as a community, as a profession, if we agreed this is not working any longer, we can do something better, we can do better. It is time to replace these with real tools of discovery and knowledge and not simply inventory. Are we done yet? When I look at our reference software, and I look at our virtual reference software that was really constructed out of help desk software in the late 90s, I ask, are we done yet? Is this it? Did we come up with the best possible way to do virtual reference? Did we really think that the way people want to get reference is to stop what they're doing, come to our websites, go into tools that we have better access to, and type in a linear format and maybe get page pushing that often does the work? Nailed it. Right? We can do better. We need to look at tools that are truly community tools. We need to understand that knowledge is created in a social context. That what we need is when someone comes in and asks a question, they need to bring their parent in with them because that's the person who tutors them. Or they need to bring their best friend in because that's the person who tells them whether it's good or not. We need to invite librarians into our questions and not have to go to the librarian and hope they know what we're talking about. We need to truly capture knowledge. When someone asks us a question, what's the number one thing we need to know? Why do you need this answer? What's the number one thing we teach librarians never to ask? Why do you need this question? Stop it. Users can deal with it. They can handle it. We need to give them more credit. We need to understand that we're being invited into their process, not asking them to come to ours. We can do better. Institutional repositories. Is this the best we can do? Remember when this was the white knight? That in fact all academic libraries figured out their new purpose in life was institutional repositories and DSpace had solved the problem? And then we put them up and we spent a lot of money and we realized 5 people come to them and we go, why? Because there's nothing that a physics professor wants to do more than go to their library and look at basic Dublin core to find out what they need. It doesn't make sense. This idea that we treat a peer-reviewed output of academic work in the same way we treat every other volume doesn't happen. And by the way, public libraries, where's your institutional repository? Where's your community minutes? Where's the workings of the government? Where's that information? You're part of this organization. Where's that institutional repositories? We can do better. We need to look at things like Public Library of Science and say, you know what, that's a pretty good, interesting repository where it brings in things like peer review, where we have curation, where we make sense of what's there for people, where it becomes something that they know about. Every academic in higher education knows what a peer-reviewed journal is, and they're increasingly accepting open access. That's what our repository should look like. That's what our institutional repository should look like. We can do better. When we look at things like our education system, see, I'm going to yell at me just as much as you. And this idea that we can give you 1 2-year degree at the beginning of your career, send you out and you're equipped for the rest of your life, we can do better. This idea that somehow that in 2.5 years we can include everything of technology, service, information organization, leadership, political skills, and we can get it all done. We can do better. What about the idea of, first of all, having a bachelor's degree in library science. Let's face it, a lot of what we do can be covered in a bachelor's degree. What about then having the master's degree to concentrate on management, administration, and beginning theory? And then let's coordinate, radical idea, our ongoing professional activities with things like certification so we can bring in people from outside the library profession easily. And what about a doctorate? A professional doctorate geared at theory and leadership and management. And we need to think that if you want to be a banker, there's a track for your education system. If you want to be a physical therapist, you have to have a master's degree and an undergraduate degree and a doctorate in it these days. And there's an ongoing continuing certification and continuing refreshing of skills. We need to look at these kinds of models and ask serious questions about, has the master's degree model of the past 50 years served us well? We can do better. And when we then do things like seed the search to everyone else, I have been at way too many conferences where people have said, libraries have lost the search game, give it up, it's Google, just get used to it. We can do better. We can do better than Google. I'll tell you how we aren't going to do better than Google. Making really good union catalogs of our collection so people can search our books. That's not going to do better. How are we not going to do better than Google? We're going to pick 500 websites and do basic cataloging on them and put them in a site. That's not going to do better. The way we're going to do better than Google is we're going to capture the knowledge. We're going to take all of you. Now, I don't know you all personally, but I can say from looking at you, you're a smart group. The knowledge that we have in our libraries, the expertise, not just of finding things, but of those degrees that we brought from other professions, of the time we spent looking into our materials, of the time we understand the questions that we have. Imagine if we took that expertise, millions and millions of questions a day that we answer on topics ranging from the Civil War to China, to the Olympics, to the economy, to everything. If we could capture that learning experience that we do on a regular basis, and we could take all of this brilliance and this expertise and their understanding of our librarians and begin to capture it and begin to collect it and begin to organize it and begin to use modern search tools and begin to use modern technology, we can do better. This is not a challenge to Google, it's a challenge to us. Google's great, but we're better. How can we do this? Where we have the noble profession to look at this and shape and build new organizations. We can do better, but we're only going to do better if we accept the obligation of leadership. We can do better. We must do better. This is my message at the end of the day. There is an obligation of everyone sitting in this room and sitting in our libraries where we're going to return to today. There is an obligation in the ivory towers of academia. There is an obligation in those who support the communities and support research. There's an obligation from Washington to Seattle to Chicago. There is an obligation for us to lead. When you talk about things like, well, Google's the best way to do search, we don't want to beat Google because it's Google. We don't want to beat Google because it's cool. We want to beat Google because we're worried about things like bias and how we send people to information and how it prioritizes things in a closed algorithm. We're worried about things like what happens when personal information is made available to tyrannical organizations. We're worried about transparency in government. We're worried about the noblest profession, and if we are worried about it, we must act on it. We have an obligation where we cannot wait for leaders to walk in. You cannot wait for the new director of your library to come in and be a visionary and say, now we change. If you wait for that person, you will wait forever, and you will not find it in a resume. And if you think the person at the top can drag you to the new organization, you have a problem. Every member of your organization, from paraprofessional to director to reference desk to technician to person who keeps the servers running, has an obligation to do it now. If not now, when? Now! We cannot wait for leaders. We cannot wait for change, and we must understand that change is hard. And we must understand that we may fail, but in failing, we have tried, and we will try again. That we may well deal with arrows coming at our backsides, but I would rather do that than simply cower and die and retire. This idea that someone has this, I talked to a library director who said, I'm having some trouble with personnel, but I figure they're going to retire in 5 years. Then I can hire a new person. Then I retire in 8 years, and so that's not my problem. That is unconscionable. If you are sitting and counting the days to someone else's retirement, you have a problem. You can do better. If you have a situation where you're hoping that that damn committee doesn't screw up the next director search and you haven't knocked and slammed on the door to be part of it, you have a problem. If you have someone come in and ask you a question and you give them an answer that you know doesn't serve their needs, you have a problem. We can do better. That ultimately we must serve this society through service. Not quiet, not transparent, not invisible, not waiting, but active and loud and taking control. If you have a committee in your public library or in your public community that's talking about youth violence, where's the librarian assigned to that committee on a regular basis to bring them information and to bring the information back to the group? If you have a speaker who comes to your library and talks, where's the videotape and is that available on the shelf? If you have children who write stories from your school library, are those stories available through the catalog as well as anything else? If you have people who want reader's advisory and they want it through a blog so they can know you better, where's the blog? We can do better. We can be active. I love the idea of in-your-face librarianship. I love the idea of kick-ass librarianship. I want people to know how important we are, but we're only important if we take on important tasks. We are only important if we can make things better and we're willing to be scrutinized for it. In an academic library, when they come to evaluate and accredit our schools, we need to be able to stand up and say, those scores, those outcomes, that impact that happened in that department, this is my part of it and I can prove it. We have to, on a regular basis, collect data, not simply to count things, but to demonstrate to people on a regular basis, our budget is that tiny compared to the impact that we have. And its impact does not come from the fact that we license full-text databases, and the impact does not come from the fact that we have catalogs, and the impact does not come from the cafe we have on the first floor. The impact comes from that we can facilitate a conversation that makes the world better, that on a daily basis we can grasp this society and make it better, because ultimately we are the future of librarianship. If you read that Salon article that says that library is going to be obsolete in 10 years, if it is, it's your fault. It's my fault. That if you look at libraries and say, oh, we're becoming less important because more stuff is available online, if you're becoming less important, it's your fault. It's my fault. If we look at it and we say, our systems aren't holding up and we're not getting what we need, it's your fault. It's my fault. If we buy a catalog or an integrated library system that isn't customizable, it's your fault, it's my fault. It's our fault. And by the way, if we don't have something better than catalogs in 3 years, it's all of our faults. I'm going to work my ass off. See, I did use the word. To try and fix this, to try and take us forward. And I ask you to do the same. I ask you to embrace the obligation of leadership and say, I'm going to take what I learned in Cincinnati and I'm going to make the world a better place. And if I get smacked down, I'm going to stand up again. And if I get smacked down 12 times, I'm going to find someplace else to do it. And if I don't like my boss, I'm going to become the boss. This is what we need to do on a regular basis. This is what it means to be a librarian. It doesn't mean you're bookish. And it doesn't mean that you're good at crossword puzzles, damn it. It means that you want to make the world better. It means that you have people that you've got to improve. I went to my high school reunion. And I heard an earful of crap about the Cincinnati Public Library. I heard some good stuff too. I don't want to be embarrassed like that for my 30th anniversary, so it's your job and my job to make sure it doesn't happen. It's your job that when people look at librarians and say, oh, isn't that cute? You go, cute? Buckle up, buddy. You need, everyone watch the post-debate review when they talk about how, well, Obama came across as professorial. I'm a professor and I was offended. When did being smart become a bad thing? When did becoming contemplative be a bad thing? When did becoming a librarian dedicated to the improvement of society and be able to stand up at a dinner party and go, what do you do for a living? I make your life better, period, enough said. That's what we need to do. That's what we need to do, and it's not going to be because someone pushed us to do it. It's not because the director said we got to do it. It's because each of us took that as our own obligation. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to invent the future, and I invite you to invent the future where we are the most important parts of it. I invite you to invent a future for my children and my mother and yourselves and your friends that we are proud to be a part of. And if you don't look at that as your mission, and if you don't look at that as your job, I ask you to please get out of the way, because the truth is that if we don't do it, we're all in trouble. And we can do it. We can do better. Thank you very much. I talk quickly, and I know some of you have to go to airplanes, but if you're willing to listen to me yell some more, are there questions or comments or things to be thrown at me? Anything else from the committee? Go in peace. Thank you all.